They opened all the gates, and we started on all four, because they let us know that the soldiers are coming. And we went out to greet the American soldiers. And we dropped to their feet and we kissed their boots. Some of them that couldn't walk, they were just crawling.
The moving tears of this Holocaust survivor are a true reflection of all the suffering she endured. They are tears of salvation, the most genuine reaction many Jewish prisoners, like Helen, could have had upon being liberated from the Nazi concentration camps. On May 8, 1945, Germany acknowledged its defeat to the Allies in World War II. By that date, around 8 million people had been displaced from their homes by the conflict. By the autumn of that year, between 6 and 7 million had been repatriated by the countries on the victorious side. In many cases, these displacements were destined for concentration camps. The prisoners in these detention centers were subjected to true atrocities. The humiliation they endured there is calamitous, beyond any description of hell. Never before has such a high level of dehumanization been reached in all of history. This is without even considering the mass extermination by gas chambers. Today, in this new installment of military history, we'll discover the challenges that concentration camp survivors, especially Jews, faced during the post-war period. Concentration camps were designated spaces for imprisoning and eliminating enemies of the Third Reich: Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and members of political parties and religious beliefs opposed to the regime. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor, hunger, and death. More than 3 million Jews were exterminated in camps in occupied Poland. When the surviving prisoners of the extermination camps were liberated, they suffered from poor health, given prolonged periods of malnutrition and exposure to unclean conditions. At the Bergen-Belsen camp, 13,000 people died after being liberated due to the deplorable conditions of confinement there. A cycle of hardship and uncertainty ensued for survivors of detention centers. Holocaust survivors had to endure the absence of close family and friends, as well as the loss of their professions, property, and possessions. Some did not even have a place to return to.
As soon as the eastern areas had been liberated by the Red Army in the summer of 1944, Jews began to wander from place to place, searching for their family members, property, and communities. Their return home was protracted and complicated. At the end of the war, Europe was plunged into chaos. Basic means of transportation were lacking, and the transportation that was to be found was irregular. Travelers often fell victim to violence along the way. When survivors arrived at their destinations, there was usually no one waiting for them. In rare cases, they would meet other family members wandering among the ruins. Many survivors discovered that their families had been murdered and that strangers were living in their homes.
In this context, stories like that of Maria Elsner are common. She traveled hundreds of kilometers with her mother and sister to return to her hometown in Hungary. They had been enslaved, having been captured and relocated by the Nazis as they advanced into Europe. At the end of the war, they walked and then traveled by train unseen because they didn't have tickets. With extreme caution, the three escaped, hidden in a small train car. The journey was from Strasshof, Austria to Hungary. They traveled in the hope of locating Mr. Elsner alive after the Nazi occupation. The scene they encountered upon arrival was devastating. Maria recounted, "Not only was Dad gone, but the house was completely empty. Not a bed, not a table, not a chair, nothing. That was our return home. There we were. Mom stood before the ruins of her existence. We imagined that when we returned, we would return to our old ways, but we never recovered our former lives. We had nothing."
The loneliness survivors faced upon liberation was at times too much to bear. During the difficult war years, the struggle to survive had left little room for thoughts about the fates of their families, loved ones, and former lives. Now that they had been liberated, the survivors were forced to face up to their losses. Their parents, partners, children, homes, cities, their entire worlds and identities were gone.
Another case is that of Władysław Lukrek. He had been separated from his only son, Tadeusz Lukrek. The young man was successively imprisoned in the Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Buchenwald concentration camps. On February 9, 1946, his father wrote to the International Tracing Service requesting information on Tadeusz's whereabouts. When the response failed to provide any substantial information, he sent letters to all the other relief organizations he could to find him. At the time of this documentary, no records exist that they have ever been reassembled. However, Władysław always held the belief that his son had been rescued at Dachau, and that therefore he must still be alive. Jews endured captivity in the extermination camps, convinced that if they were released, they would find their families as they remembered them. Later, those who survived had to face an opposite reality: the disappearance of their families and the helplessness that this entailed. Liberation marked the beginning of an exodus for Jews who wanted to restart their lives outside the detention centers. Many of those who were saved wanted to emigrate abroad. They saw Europe as a burial ground for the Jewish people and a reminder of what they had lost.
In Western Europe as well, the Jewish survivors faced many difficulties from their neighbors and from the bureaucratic organizations tasked with caring for them.
Those released from the camps preferred Palestine or the United States as their destination, although those countries restricted their access in the early post-war years. The reason was political. Between 1945 and 1948, there were almost no options for Jews to leave Europe. Palestine remained under British rule until 1947, when the UN separated it into two autonomous states. Israel became independent in 1948 through a government agency, the Jewish Agency for the Land of Israel. It was then that mass immigration became possible. Meanwhile, the United States maintained isolationist policies in the years following World War II. This made it difficult for Jews to access that nation for several years. Given this situation, the Allies initiated the creation of certain types of temporary housing for people displaced by the war.
Many of the Jews had nowhere to go and nowhere to return to, and so they remained in the former concentration camps. According to the Allies' definition, they became displaced persons. The survivors, who only a few weeks before had been prisoners in these camps, now found themselves living in them as free people.
The habitability of the displaced persons camps was far from adequate. Many precarious circumstances contributed to the continued unrest of their inhabitants.
Conditions in the DP camps, especially at the beginning, were very difficult. Some of the camps were located in former concentration camps. Some of them were even located in former German army barracks, so that many of the survivors were walking around behind barbed wire, still in their concentration camp uniforms. Food and medicine were very scarce. The death rate remained high for weeks. And still, these refugees streamed into the DP camps. For many, it would be the place where they would take their first steps forward.
There were different classes of displaced persons: concentration camp survivors, slave laborers, prisoners of war, and military personnel. Inside, these places were often unsanitary due to the overcrowding of inmates and the lack of medicine and food supplies. The population distribution also undermined the peaceful coexistence of the refugees because they were grouped according to their nationalities. This fostered discord among inmates, allowing former prisoners to intermingle with their Nazi camp captors due to their shared nationality. The atmosphere in the displaced persons camps was oppressive and miserable. The displaced persons continued to live in the same concentration camps, still wearing their prisoner uniforms. They did not perceive their liberation as such, but as a condition of survival. Earl G. Harrison was appointed by then-President of the United States, Harry Truman, to investigate the reality of the displaced persons camps. Harrison was a lawyer and an experienced American public servant who had a successful academic career in the field of law. He was also known for his outstanding political career during the presidential terms of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt inspected the settlements, focusing on the needs of the Jewish inmates, and recommended the establishment of new institutions to address the specific needs of that community. On August 24, 1945, the operation culminated in the famous Harrison Report. The document exposed the abysmal conditions endured by Jews in the displaced persons camps. Similarly, camps for former Jewish prisoners were also established in the British zone of Germany in December 1945. The regular operation of the camps was hampered by significant setbacks. A lack of professionally trained personnel a shortage of clothing, food, and medicines in relation to the number of refugees, a failure to treat psychological disorders common among concentration camp survivors, and the rise of anti-Semitism both nationally and internationally, and the increase in the population of orphans and newborns in the refugee communities. Despite the obstacles, the displaced were able to establish communities where cultural expressions played a decisive role. Thanks to the support of relief organizations, the camps promoted the creation of schools, the celebration of religious holidays, the publication of newspapers, the composition of literary, theatrical, and musical works, and the formation of sports teams. From a political perspective, Zionism gained significant relevance in these spaces. This political movement advocated for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestinian territory. Former Jewish prisoners furthered this ideology through groups that expressed themselves through publications, artistic performances, assemblies, and protests. An example of the cohesion achieved in these communities was the number of weddings and births, which grew exponentially over the years.
There was an astonishing number of marriages in the DP camps, sometimes as many as 6 every day. And after the marriages came children. In fact, the survivors' birth rate was higher than anywhere else in the world. In the Bergen-Belsen camp alone, 555 babies were born in 1946. And by 1948, the camp was celebrating the birth of the 1,000th baby. All of these things were manifestations of the survivors' drive to live, and not only to live, but also to create new life.
The increase in marriages and births marked the peak of the displaced persons camps. However, after this peak, a period began that led to the extinction of the camps. 2 factors led to the progressive closure of the camps in Germany. First, the State of Israel was created. Second, the United States Displaced Persons Act was enacted in 1948. This led to a wave of European immigrants, mainly to Palestine. 177,109 Jews left their countries for new destinations. Only 20,000 Jews remained in Germany, so the camps were closed one after another. By 1952, only 1 displaced persons camp remained open. It was in Fürstenwald, southwest of Munich. There, in the heart of the U.S. occupation zone, this camp had been opened in June 1945, and at one point housed approximately 4,000 inmates. Initially, it served as a shelter for slave laborers, but after the Harrison Report, it was converted into a shelter for Jewish concentration camp survivors. The closure of the displaced persons camps lasted from 1948 to 1950. A small group of former prisoners remained in Germany, as they were composed of elderly or sick refugees who found it impossible to travel to another country. This group, known as the Hardcore, was transferred to Fürstenwald. Despite their old age or physical ailments, what truly affected these individuals was the absence of every meaningful human connection they had forged before the war.
Survivors who were alone tried to make new human connections. They reached out for other survivors who instinctively understood the trauma and the loss they had experienced without having to discuss it too much.
In this sense, the story of a man who refused to give in to loneliness is valuable. Joseph H. was a 70-year-old man who had lost his wife and children in detention centers. He was known for his deeply religious temperament and his quiet, reserved nature. He spoke to few people in the camp and gave Hebrew lessons to the children. He was also someone who waited and was willing to help. At his age, he had little time to waste, although he seemed to be driven by a small spark of hope. His aspiration was to be reunited with his only remaining relative, his brother who lived in England. He couldn't visit him due to his advanced age, and although no one told him, he seemed to understand this limitation. Nevertheless, Joseph would ask once a week if there was any news about his emigration. When he received none, one day he stopped doing so and decided to continue caring for his companions in the displaced persons camp. In the end, although life managed to break him, it didn't deprive him of his dignity.
From their testimony, we can learn that, alongside feelings of despair and emptiness, survivors were also filled with a strong urge to live and a burning desire to return to normality and resume their lives, even if that meant finding a new meaning for their lives.
The last displaced persons from Fürstenwald were reassigned to apartments, which were inaugurated on February 28, 1957. With this event, the era of the displaced persons camps officially ended. Throughout Germany, there were groups of liberated Jews who preferred to live outside the DP camps. Thanks to their initiative, external units were formed in different regions of the country. These organizations were supported by the Gemeinden, German Jewish communities. The latter worked in coordination with relief agencies, such as the Jewish Relief Unit and the American Joint Distribution Committee. The Gemeinden assisted the displaced persons in their search for housing, food, and medical services. These communities also addressed the survivors' legal concerns, such as property claims and the submission of wartime persecution certificates. They also functioned as community centers, organizing social events related to culture and education. Finally, the Gemeinden looked after displaced Jews in danger, given the rise of anti-Semitism in 1947 and the increase in vandalism in community cemeteries. Many displaced people ended up working in their local communities, many working in administrative tasks and providing educational or translation services. While at the beginning of World War II, there were nearly 40,000 Jewish refugees in France by the end of the war. After the Nazi advance, only about 8,000 Jews remained. The survivors of working age were left destitute. They lost their homes, belongings, and clothing. Those Jews who had retained property titles found them worthless in 1945, so they rented hotel rooms, which reduced their income by half. The elderly refugees distrusted the French state because of its betrayal during the occupation, so they avoided collecting government allowances. They did not want to receive public money for fear of social reprimands. The situation in England was also not optimal. Although many freed Jews were able to naturalize in that country, they remained marginalized there. In 1955, a leading figure of German Jews in Great Britain stated that many of them had found work, but that the low wages did not allow them to save enough money to achieve financial stability. They had none of the money they had brought from Germany left, nor did they have relatives to turn to for contributions. For the elderly, retirement was not an option. They feared the day an accident would prevent them from continuing to work. Their living conditions were distressing, and there were no support networks to improve them.
Survivors immigrated to all parts of the world, with the majority of them reaching and settling in the United States and in Israel. Wherever they went, they contributed to the societies in which they settled. For Jewish survivors, the end of the war was merely the beginning of a difficult journey. They needed to adapt to living with the scars of loss and the memories that they would continue to carry with them. Though some survivors never recovered from the trauma of the Holocaust, most of them managed to build a new life.
Marianka Zadikov's testimony reveals the struggles Jews faced in making their way in other countries. This woman found few job opportunities to further her social advancement. But in her eagerness to forge a new path, she never gave up. She had been deported to Theresienstadt with her parents, where one of them died. When they returned to her hometown Prague, the outlook was so bleak that she contemplated suicide. However, Marianka managed to emigrate to the United States using her displaced person status. There, she hoped to complete her academic studies, but that opportunity was denied. She then married and had 2 daughters. The family home brought joy to her life. Marianka worked on a chicken farm with her husband for 17 years, until his death. Having to support her daughters, she worked as a custodian in public schools. The long hours distanced her from family and others. At that stage of her life, she had no contact with anyone. There are countless examples of concentration camp prisoners who, having escaped from that hell, found a world in which their closest loved ones had disappeared. This brought them to the limits of their strength, to a state of absolute freedom, where they questioned whether to continue living or not. Mr. Mason courageously recounts how a very powerful inner force prevented him from falling into despair at the worst moment of his life. There, he discovered the intrinsic value that every human existence possesses and yearns to be fulfilled. The accounts of concentration camp survivors do not draw triumphalist conclusions. These testimonies allow us to realize the existence of people who lost everything and who, despite this, had the determination to carry on. Figures indicate that 245,000 Holocaust survivors currently live in more than 90 countries. 119,300 in Israel, 38,400 in the United States, 21,900 in France, and 14,200 in Germany. In Latin America, there are 300 displaced people in Brazil, 200 in Argentina, and fewer than 100 in Mexico. One thing we know for sure is that the common denominator among these people may be constant loss and loneliness, but also resilience and adaptation in the desire to continue living. Now, after learning what happened to the survivors of the concentration camps after the war, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for being with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.